All right, got our folks starting to come in. Got people coming in on Zoom and on LinkedIn and on YouTube. And so as folks make their connections in, we'll just ask you to take a look at the question that we have here. What does trust mean to you? And we're going to talk about that as we get further in and how that connects into the research that Roxanne and I have been doing on joy at work. But we got our folks connected in now on Zoom, and here come the rest on LinkedIn. So I think we are ready to get going. So let's get rolling, everyone. So welcome. I'm Ed Cook, and with me is Roxanne. And we're going to be talking about the question around making a decision to go back to the office, which is maybe the most consequential decision of this year. We'll talk more about that and why we're finding that to be true. This is popping up for us with many of our clients, and we're hearing it all over the place as well. So it's definitely an important one that is affecting lots of folks. All right, so this fits into the series of webinars that we have. This is in our Change Leader series, and you can see the rest of them that we've got and how they are connected. And so we're doing two every month, and the first ones are usually more analytics based, and the second ones that we do in the latter part of the month are more of a change leader based, or just leadership in general. So we have those fairly regularly every month. And this model that you see here we'll be referring to as we go throughout our program today is our change and joy model. And the idea here is that how change happens has an impact to the culture of a company, what Roxanne and I refer to as joy at work. And you can see out to the right there the 10 dimensions that we've identified as being indicative of joy at work. And trust there at the top, which is why we highlighted that for you at the beginning, because this is going to be an important component as we really start to think about this question around going back to the office and how to make that decision. Trust is going to be key for all of that. So here's what we mean by trust. Trust is my willingness to risk being dependent on others for my personal success. And that's a critical notion when we start to think about a leader making the decision to go back to the office. The leader is giving trust to everyone else in the company about how they do the work and what they're doing. And the leader's success is dependent on others for that. And that's true whether you're the CEO and true for every single manager that works within the organization. And so that notion of the amount of trust that's there and how that relates back and impacts to the culture is going to be an important one for us to think about as we're going through this idea of going back to the office.
Yeah, and we've been focusing a lot on trust lately because we're hearing from people that as this time where we're apart is more prolonged, it's easy for relationships at work to feel more transactional and less interdependent, or even willingness to be interdependent on each other's success, less invested in each other. So this has come up for us a lot recently, and certainly trust and being deliberate and intentional about how to build trust amongst others, even when you're together. I mean, even though we, in some cases, are going back to the office, there's still that hybrid model that exists now for many companies because they've hired outside of their location and will probably be comfortable doing that from here forward. So at any rate, the idea of being intentional about building trust is probably going to be something that we need to do in this hybrid situation that we'll be in for a long time.
So here are the three areas that we'll focus on. We'll talk about a decision. So what is a decision? What's a good one look like? And then we'll get into the office itself and compose the question, why go back to the office? And then we'll finish on this idea of values. And that's going to be a key item that you're going to hear throughout the next 30 minutes or so as we're talking about making decisions, understanding what you value, and then being able to use that to make a values-based decision is going to increase dramatically your decision hygiene. So not necessarily guaranteeing you're going to make the right decision and somehow see into the future and avoid all obstacles, but you'll make a better decision as a result of that and a much higher quality process with it. So let's jump in and talk about that. So what is good decision hygiene? Well, what does that even mean? And so this wraps around the idea of a process, how you go about making the decision. And this is the process that we would lay out for folks in terms of making a decision. This is good decision hygiene is really about how you go about deciding. It's not about guaranteeing the best decision. There's a whole philosophical argument about how you even know it's the best decision. But if you've got a good process, then you've done all that you're going to be able to do in order to make as good a decision as you possibly can. And we're going to walk through each of these 5 steps and try and give you a shorthand for how to actually do them. So we think even following these and even at this level is going to dramatically improve your ability to make a quality decision. So it begins first with the idea of the decision question. And so we would advocate that you literally put the decision in the form of a question. So, and this is true for analytics in general. This is something that I advocate for my students when I'm teaching at the University of Richmond and the analytics classes is before you go analyze, know the question that you're trying to answer. That's how you can avoid this idea of analysis paralysis, because once you've answered the question, then you know you're done. And same here. So once you've been able to answer the decision, you know it's been made. You want to really focus on outcomes, so not get wrapped around really essentially a specific answer to the question. Like your setup is basically your answer, and so there's almost no point in putting it together. And as a little bit of a test, if you can state the thing in the opposite, then you probably don't have that great of a decision question. So as an example, if we're going to look at our decision question about going back to the office, maybe we would pose something like this. How do we start to use our office so that we increase productivity without negatively impacting the culture? Right. So, as a test, we would never state it the other way around. How do we start using the office so that we decrease productivity without positively impacting the culture? Okay, so we could, sort of play with our question here and try and tighten it up a little bit, but this at least gets us in the right general direction for something that's going to be useful. So now that we have our decision question, we want to move to the next step and start to think about stakeholders. And when we talk about stakeholders, we mean them in the same sense that change management thinks about them and project management thinks about them, decisions think about them, all the same, all the people that are going to be impacted or could have an influence on the decision. And so if you can go broad and get to some level of divergency in the people that you have, that's better, right? So we're able to make sure that we're getting a good view all the way across. And then we want to get into this idea of what is the one thing that each stakeholder cares about the most. And that's going to help us to be able to start to really understand the breadth of this decision and what the impacts are. And we're starting to tippy toe into the idea of values when we start to ask what people care about. So here's some possibilities that we might see. We really want to look at 2 components here. So what is the thing that they value, and then how would you actually go about measuring it, right? And you want to be able to do both. So you can see in the 6 that we have here, there's sort of varying levels of goodness. And if you start to look at each of the statements, think about how would you actually evaluate the effectiveness? Do you know what it is that they value? And do you know how you would go about measuring it? So if you look at what the manufacturing people have to say, don't care, we have always been in the office, you might be able to guess what they value, but it's not all that easy to understand what they want to have measured there. It's sort of a grumpy saying. Whereas the legal people want to minimize any legal risk from going back to the office. And okay, that we get what their value. You can imagine how you would go about measuring it. You probably need to go down a level or two in order to be able to get to that. But that's the sort of thing that we want to walk through. What do you care about? What do you value? And then how would you know what that value actually is? And use that as a way to start to determine really what's going on, start to lead you in to the next section, which is to actually determine what the values are. And so we would do this by actually asking people in the old days when we used to get together and write things out on sticky notes to literally write them out on sticky notes. Just to answer the question, what do you value in this decision? And it could go all over the place, right? And people will write and write and write. And so a good way to go through that is to ask people to write, and just as a little psychological trick for you, then ask everybody to say how many did they actually produce, and then tell everybody else that number is the new number that they all need to get to. And people will amazingly come up with other things that they value, and even whoever was highest will continue to write and pull more in. And it's a useful way to get people to really think and pull out what are all the things that they truly care about. And then lay all those out. And when I say that, I mean, you can be physically on the table if you're all together. It could be on some sort of electronic whiteboard if you want to use Mural or one of those tools, and put them on a bunch of computer screens so you can do it virtually. But then start to arrange them into themes. And then a little bit of an ordering, this idea of means to ends, right? So not everything is the final end goal. Some things are means to get to that. And so you can see a super simple example of that here. And in this example on the far right, there are three things that popped out as the truly end objectives that this team cared about. They want to keep or increase the productivity by going back to the office. They want to strengthen the culture by going back to the office, but they also want to mitigate the transition risk. So any bad things that might happen as they start to bring people back to the office, and start to think about how to take care of those. The things that are further to the left would be areas that you might want to pay attention to, even measure, but really what you care about ultimately are the three things that are on the right. And so you would want to work together to come up with that, as a group, and decide, yep, this makes sense to us. We're actually covering all the things that we need to cover. And we really know what we value. You'll notice in this process so far, we haven't said a single thing about how we're going to go back to the office. So we haven't done that at all yet. And that's critical here. I'm going to talk about that more later, is that we do not want to start with the alternatives. We want to start with what we value. And that's why we're doing it in this order. But once we've got that, then we could start to think about how do we now generate some alternatives. And so we might take the things that we've put together, those ones that were the greens and the oranges, the ones that were to the left further in our setup, and lay those out just as we have here, and then start to think about the possibilities that are super sort of boring and conventional, and the ones that are a little bit more crazy and loony, that kind of pushes your thinking. And the point of doing that is to expand the range of how you think about what might be possible here. Because again, we're trying to generate alternatives that could be useful, not pick here. We're trying to generate the range of alternatives, and the wider we can go, the better we'll be able to do in really exploring the possibilities. And then from there, what we want to do is create a walk through these different alternative components to create a full alternative. So just let me take you through a little example here. So let's say as we look across from left to right, the first thing we do is say that as part of being transparent in our process, we're going to hold town halls to discuss what's going on with our move back to the office. And then we are going to post the plan on the company website, and we'll include employee suggestions in there. And that helps with our integrated coordination of what we're doing. And then we might go back to the office bonuses, because we're worried about our retention and we want to keep it high. And we are going to create a financial incentive for people to do just that and go back to the office. We're going to try and issue a press release because we want to tell everybody that we're doing this and have a positive view out into the world and why we want to go back out to the office. And then finally engage the company in a discussion about the why of the company and how the office itself actually contributes. And all that together we could call alternative one and summarize that as a town hall focused communication to guide the process with some significant external transparency. So that's just one. That's one possible alternative. And this is a way to start to generate more and more of an ideas about how you would actually go do that. So the decision includes all of those components because how you do this thing is going to impact the values that are there. And for those of you that are engaged in change management, you know how important the how is for all of this. How you go through and manage the change is going to be critical to the success here. And so this is just a technique to try and generate some alternatives so that now you can pull together to actually look across all the alternatives, contemplate the things that you value, and then make the decision, which is really the final step in this process, which gets to, well, really, what is a decision? And so here is a definition that we really like. A decision is an irrevocable allocation of resources. I know it sounds super wonky, but let me tell you why we like it. So everyone I've ever asked this question to always nods or says yes. Have you ever been in a meeting where you're talking about something and someone says, didn't we decide this a couple of weeks ago? And it happens all the time. And what we would say is that a couple of weeks ago, you did not decide because a couple of weeks ago, you didn't allocate the resources in a way that you couldn't take back, that wasn't irrevocable. And so you didn't write the check or have the people start to work on the project or greenlight the merger or whatever it is was the decision. You just said that seems like a good way to go, but that was it. You didn't take the next step. The group didn't take the next step to actually kick off the decision. And that's really important in this process.
Yeah, and to bring this back to going back to the office, we have heard from lots of folks that they've made the decision and they've even communicated it, but people aren't doing it. And when they talk to the people, they're confused. They're sort of saying, does this really apply to me? Do I really have to do it? So until there is some signal to the people that have to do it, to them, the decision hasn't really been made. So that's just another way to think about how, what does it mean to make a decision like that? It needs to go all the way to the point of irrevocable allocation of resources.
So lots of ways to communicate things, and this is going to depend on how people think about it. This 4-stack model is a model that we think about in communication in general, right? So how we would communicate anything in the context of being a manager or a leader. So whatever that thing is that we're trying to communicate, we want to think about the why, what, and how. Certainly that's part of the message, but the medium matters a bunch here as well. So where does it go to actually indicate that you've made the decision? And it's not usually appropriate to only use one of these for every single decision that you're going to go do. So you don't want to always just kick it out on email or always have a group meeting. You want to think about the kind of decision that you're making here, the change that you're about to step into with the decision as well, because you're right on the edge now. You're converting over from the decision mode into the change mode. And this communication is, for better or worse, the delineator between the two. And so thinking through where is that going to land best is going to be really important for what you're trying to do here. So you don't want to overinvest with a big giant meeting to talk about something that people will more or less shoulder shrug. They would have been just as happy if you had posted it or maybe sent an email. And you definitely don't want to just send something in Slack if you're talking about a really meaty change that people are going to care about and want to ask questions for. You want to think about what that interaction is, because you are now starting the change process. And however well this beginning goes sets the tone for how the rest of the process is going to go. And are you digging out of a hole, or are you starting from a place where you are increasing trust? So are people trusting more as a result of how you do this, or trusting less as a result of how people are doing this? And that's going to have an impact on your culture as well. So the 5 steps that we have here are just all part of really making sure that you get to good decision hygiene, right? So do you have a decision question and get that stated up front? Do you find all the stakeholders and choose broadly, but still relevant to the decision, not just pulling people in? Understand what all of those stakeholders value, and then pull that into a structure, this sort of means to end structure. So not every single thing is equally important. Some of them are leading to other things. And then choose the alternatives and try and make that as wide as possible. Use the values that you stated to then evaluate those alternatives, and then finally communicate the decision. So actually make the decision by communicating it, because now it's out the door, decisions have been made, and people can start taking action. Now you've truly made a decision. So let's go and zoom a little bit now in on the office itself. So why go back to the office? I'm sure employees are asking, well, I know employees are asking that question when they're being told, hey, we're going back to the office. Why? Why are we going back to the office? So what we have heard from leaders are these 3 things. The reason to go back to the office is, 1, for culture. So what makes the team special is diminishing because we're not together. Productivity. We repeatedly hear from leaders that we're just not as productive as we used to be, even though the employees might actually think they are, and find themselves quite busy. What we're hearing from leaders is the numbers don't lie. We are just not as productive. And then finally, there's a balance issue. So work and every other aspect of life has become even more interweaved as a result of not having that physical break to go to the office, and it's burned people out. So they're struggling not only with the amount of time they're spending at work, but the inability to separate from it. Even harder now than it used to be, although we were quite tethered even before with computers and smartphones and the rest of the things that we had to kind of keep us all together.
Yeah, and they reminded me of a conversation that we had recently with a leader who talked about the ideal commute. Apparently you could probably Google this to find out what the quote unquote ideal commute is. And there's some data on it about how I think it's 40 minutes is the ideal, because that's enough separation time between one place and the next where you can start to get your brain into where you're going, whether that's home or work. So anyway, I thought that was so interesting. He said he and his wife made a decision about where to live based on this concept of the ideal commute. Anyway, I have not looked that up, but I thought that was really interesting because some of our commutes today are, steps instead of certainly 40 minutes.
Right.
So you might have to manufacture a commute of some kind.
27 seconds to go across from the living room to your second bedroom office.
Right.
So the big idea here is think of the office as a tool. And like any other tool, it has a specific use. And so trying to understand what that specific use is really the key to trying to figure this whole thing out. And so just to use an example, think of a software development company that's going back to the office. This is a company that we've worked with. We brought people together and asked them, why go back to the office? And these are some of the things that came up, right? Collaboration and innovation. It was about our culture, team building, creativity, communicate better. And we pushed a bit on this and said, are you not doing any of these things now remotely? And they're like, yeah, we do collaborate and we do creative things, etc. So what will be different when you go back to the office? And that's really the thing to sort of zoom in on. And it really became this idea. Can we think about things that we just can't do when we're working remotely? There's something that is better about being able to come together physically. That it was certainly around before. There's a reason people got on airplanes and traveled all over the place before the pandemic, because there's something valuable about being in person. We had these tools and were able to work remotely before. And to be fair, there are lots of organizations that have worked in various kinds of remote setups. So certainly companies, very large companies that are in multiple states or multiple countries, have been doing a form of this for decades, where you're able to work remotely. And we use electronic tools like email and telephones and video to be able to do that. But still, there was travel involved, because there was something about being able to be in person that allowed you to do something more effectively. So what we would say the key here is to know, what is that? So it can't just be everyone jump back into the office and go start working in person again with nothing else to describe where that value is going to come from. Maybe it will show up just sort of organically, but even better would be to be planful about that and know what you're going to do in the office is going to be different than what you were doing remotely.
Yeah, and Ed and I have led large teams in the past and located all over the US and outside the US. And we used to be deliberate about bringing people together at certain points, because the goal was there would be a rapid exchange of information by bringing everyone together. So it wasn't just team building, or it wasn't just, sort of relaxing and, doing things like spa appointments, things like that. We actually didn't do any of that. We really focused on what could be learned and shared while they were together, and how could it be done in a way that it surprised them and delighted them, as if so like they were the customer in a large way. But the goal was, that they learned from each other. So we used a lot of infotainment kind of techniques. The point is that even though we work together primarily in separate locations, these times when we got together were quite intense and had an accelerating effect that lasted. It wasn't a blip on the screen kind of thing. It was a lasting relationship builder. And you could see that in evidence the next day. And so that's how we used it. We were very deliberate about what could we do only if we were together.
Right. And I think that is a big culture driver, right? Because now you're being thoughtful about what does it mean to be together. It's a recognition that people's time is valuable and their energy is valuable. And so you're really thinking about bringing them back together. And with one of these companies I've been working with, we're walking through how meetings might need to be different, right?
Mm-hmm.
Don't just throw people into a room. Managers can't be lazy about it. They need to be planful about putting meetings together. And that's not new. People have been talking about that for decades, right? Having, agendas and thinking through what you're doing with the time together. That's all the same stuff, but it's going to show up even more starkly now, because people will be thinking, wow, I could be home right now in my sweatpants doing this, because there's nothing going on while I'm in this meeting room that is more valuable than if I was back at home. And so what would make it that way? How do you start working with people and getting people to interact in a way that being together actually matters?
Yeah, and one example that comes to mind is when we were working on an all hands meeting where we were, again, getting all of the folks together. It was about 250 people in that situation. And we were working on what would be in the presentation. And I remember saying to Ed at the time, why would we show people PowerPoint slides when they're physically going to be together? They're going to get plenty of PowerPoint slides before they come together and after. So why would we get them in a room to have someone stand up and just do basically the same thing they would do in a meeting. And that sparked creativity immediately.
Yeah, so I hadn't really thought about it before, and it was strange to have it sort of really land on me so dramatically when Roxanne was talking about it, because from then we just went quite a bit different than what other people would do. We did 2-act plays and set meetings up in the form of late night talk shows. We had interviews for executives instead of having executives come and give pretty boring speeches. We just came up with very different ways to convey the same information, but with a purpose, a very specific purpose that we would write out, an emotional purpose and an informational purpose. We really work our way through what do we want everyone to know, feel, and then do. And use that again and again as a way to guide us in what we're going to go do. And those became immensely popular, not just because people were entertained, they were, but because we got stuff done as a result of that too. And they became cultural touchstones as a result of that. And that flowed in a bunch of smaller ways as well. It flowed into how we would do our weekly meeting, because we would really think about how are we doing this weekly meeting? What does it mean to get people together? In this case, it was partly physically together and partly on the phone because people were scattered in different places, but it became much more planful, which required more work for me and Roxanne to be able to put that together.
Sure.
But we're talking about impacting sometimes dozens of people, sometimes hundreds of people. And that was really valuable for us to take the time to go do that and pull this all towards us more and more to this idea of culture. And this is actually where we started to get this idea of joy at work. And so last year, one of the things that we put together was this guide to joy at work, which you can find on Amazon or Barnes & Noble or any of those places. And it gives you some exercises that you can go through to think about the kinds of things that we were thinking about. How do we start to get our brains wrapped around this idea of how we're going to use our in-person time differently so that we're able to have a more useful impact on what the culture was going to be. So that brings us to the last idea that we really wanted to share with you, which is the idea of a values-based decision. And I've said values, and we showed that to you before, but we really want to get a little further into like, what do we mean when we're going to go use that? And then how are we then communicating from there once we're at the place where we made a decision? Talked about this decision point is kind of the switch over from when you're making the decision to when you're actually moving into the change. And there are potentially multiple things that might be happening here. And walking your way through those carefully can be really important. So here are 3 change decision cases, right? And the first one is you're communicating a decision. So you are the decision maker and you have made the decision. So that ends the decision-making phase and takes you into the change phase, right? We're not revisiting the decision anymore. You have made the decision. So when you get a group of people, your team, your company together, what you want to start with is, this is a decision. I have now made it. And you can ask these 3 questions. What do you like about it? What do you find challenging? And what are your recommendations for overcoming those challenges?
Yeah, so the idea here is, while the people participating don't have a say in what the decision is, they can have an influence in how well it's implemented. And by asking these questions, you're inviting people into that influence so that you can, they basically can help you figure out how to make this happen.
Yeah, and so being crystal clear that the decision has been made and this is now about the change is really important here. The next step over would be, you are still the decision maker, but now you want to get input on the decision, right? So again, you're telling people, you're not making the decision, I am, but I really need your input into this. And so you want to state the decision question. Here's the thing I'm trying to decide. And you can walk down this path, just a few things to do. Ask them to write down their thoughts about that decision. have them share those, and you can ask questions about what's going on. And you're taking all that in, and you want to finish that meeting by stating how the decision will be shared, which really kind of kicks you back over to the first one, right? So you're going to take this away, make the decision, and you're going to come back to them with, all right, here's the decision, and then walk through those 3 questions again.
Yeah, and that second bullet, have them share their thoughts and you ask questions. You know, one of the things that we've run into is that the loudest voice will have the most influence. So we use the round robin technique to make sure that everyone gets an opportunity to share their piece. And the reason why I'm calling that out is, you know, people like to, people feel better if they are, you know, asked, they actually are able to give their input in. They feel like you really meant it when you asked me for my input. So that's why we recommend the round robin technique.
And then if you're making a true group decision, well, that's what we shared at the beginning, right? You state the decision question, you're asking the people to write down what they value, you lay out the alternatives, and then you're going to evaluate those alternatives as a group and then make a decision as a group. So that can be a very powerful way to go about making a decision, but only if you, the leader, are truly ready to let the group make it. Do not let them think that you are making a group decision and then hold the decision rights yourself. Do the second approach if you're going to do that, because all you're going to do is confuse people and potentially anger people when they find out that they're not really in it with you, that you're going to make the decision. So stating that up front can be really clarifying. And we've talked with many managers that are reluctant about that. Oh, that feels too much like a dictator. And I certainly understand that. And I've been using pretty strong language through here. And I would not recommend that you use the language that strongly. However, we would strongly recommend that you are as clear as you can possibly be about what the process is, because you don't want to invite people into a process where they think they are doing one thing, but you're really going to use that information and execute the decision in a different way.
Yeah, and so before we move off this group decision concept, we like to use the example of a very simple, like real life example of, you know, deciding where to go for lunch with a group of people, or maybe with your partner deciding where to go for dinner, you know, out to a restaurant. You can imagine, and I'm sure you've been in this situation where people start offering up ideas, but don't, you know, but people sort of shut down. Well, no, I don't like this. Well, no, I don't. And you end up chasing your tail around. That's your concept of throwing out the solutions before understanding what everyone values. So instead, you ask the group or whomever, okay, what do we value? And you just sort of go around and around and see what people value. You find out, oh, well, I value sitting outside. I value having vegetarian options. I value being close to the office. I value whatever those things are. And then that narrows down your possibilities. It's instead of you guessing, you can start to figure out, oh, okay, well then here's the solution set, if you want to use the technical speak.
Yeah.
And so we do this all the time. You know, where do you want to go? I don't know. What do we value? And it's just kind of a silly little step, but it's remarkably effective. So that's just a very simple example of how to use this values-based group decision technique that Ed's been talking about.
Right. So I look forward to hearing about all your better dinner choices now as a result of that. All right. So just to review then what we've talked about, we talked about the decision process. So how do you create good decision hygiene? You execute a process to go do that. How would we suggest you think about the office? Think about it as a tool. And so how are you applying that tool? Just like any other tool, you don't want to overuse it. You want to think about the office and not overuse it or underuse it. So think about it in its place within your organization and how to do something good with that. And when you get to what is really at the heart of a good decision, you got to state what you value in order for that to really happen. All right, well, that brings us to the end. And just to point to where we're going next month, we'll start with persuasive presentations. So thinking about how to use data to really make a presentation that drives and persuades. And we'll talk about communicating change. We sort of stepped into that a bit here, but communicating change with empathy in the second half of May will be how we'll finish up the month there. We do have a little mini course coming that Roxanne and I have been working on that's about impact assessments and change stories. So how to do those. And it was inspired actually by one of our clients. We were visiting them about a year ago after we haven't visited people for a year. And we're actually in the office with him, and he's showing us around their new office that they got just before COVID. So that was a little sad because they got their new office and then couldn't actually use it. And it was lovely. But what he shared with us is that everything that we're doing right now, Ed and Roxanne, it's all about impact assessments and change stories.
Yeah.
And that was so gratifying to hear because we had done some training work with them and they were using the tools, these two tools in particular, to really just get a handle on what is going on with the change and what the impact is of the people. And just getting that far was really valuable for them. And so Roxanne and I have just recently put together the components of a course, and we'll have that out the door here for folks to be able to use shortly. And that's really an opportunity for people to see just a little bit about what we offer, because we have a whole series of courses that are out there that bridge off of this and other ideas that we've just talked about today. All right, and that's it. That touches on all the things we wanted to talk about. So thank you for taking some time to hang out with us. It's coming soon. If you are ACMP members, we have a couple of conference sessions at the end of June during the ACMP's global conference, one on calculating a change ROI. It's one of our change analytics pieces, but also on talk about artificial intelligence and change management. So I've been starting to teach machine learning and artificial intelligence at the university, and Roxanne and I have been exploring like how to go about bringing that into how we do change management. And then just a month or so later in August, we'll have a webinar through ACMP that really kind of talks about our origin story. So it's okay to be in the pit, just don't decorate. Right. So how do you pull your team out of the dumps and turn around a program that was in considerable trouble? And then here's some information about us if you want to get in touch with us. So I see that some people have thrown some stuff in the chat. If you guys have some other questions, I'd like to put those in the chat. We'd love to talk about that. So Pamela is asking, what if everyone values is having a 20-second commute? How do you address their resistance to coming into the office if they don't see a benefit? Yeah, I think, Pamela, that's exactly the thing that everyone is dealing with right now. And the process that we're starting to walk down with this one company that we were talking about is for them to be able to talk about the values and the value that is had by being in the office, right? And started to show where that can be. And that's just as a simple trick for that is for the leadership team to make sure that they are in the office, and that if they are working with each other, that they're doing that in the office, and that when the leadership team is broadcasting out anything to the rest of the company, they're doing that from the office and actually demonstrating how things can be better. I mean, there's certainly value to the 20-second commute, right? So that makes sense that people would not want to necessarily have that time be burned up, but there is also value that is in the interaction. And so each company is going to need to work their way through what is that value, and then when do we get it? Because sometimes you don't. I mean, you are actually more productive if you're just at your own computer doing your own thing. But then there are going to be times when you are more productive by being together. So what is that? So we are advocating, do not go after a blanket approach and just say, all right, that's it. Everyone back in the pool. I expect to see everybody here 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Monday through Friday. And that's it. And that's all you've talked about. You need to come up with something that's going to be more nuanced than that.
Yeah, one of the things that, Pamela, we're seeing is the disconnect between what employees experience, meaning they feel like they're productive, and and they feel like the workload is more, right? That's a definite theme that we're seeing. But leaders are seeing that the numbers don't look like that at all. Actually, it's less productive. So there's definitely this disconnect. And so we've been working with the company to get a set of representatives, a set of employees across different parts of their organization to come together and look at this more deeply and try to solve the problem. In other words, involve the employees in figuring out what to do about this. It's a deeper problem than just, hey, let's figure out how to make the office better. A better place to go and work when you're there physically. Certainly there's some goodness in that, but there's also some goodness in making it a real business problem that you are engaging the workforce in attempting to solve. It doesn't mean involving everyone, because that's unrealistic, but just like putting together a change network, you would identify people across the company that would be willing to get engaged in this. And then you'd want to make sure that the groups are well represented. So in other words, people across the company would feel like, oh yeah, our group was perspective would be well represented amongst this group of people tackling this problem, because when they come up with solutions, there's credibility in their solutions because of who they represent. I'm not suggesting that that's the answer to everything, but it is one of many ways to try and help people see that there is a real issue here. It's not just an ego, leaders wanting people to be in the office. That goes beyond that. It may be an ego thing in some cases. I'm not suggesting that's untrue, but if you can make it more of a business problem, people will tend to get more into that and try and solve it.
All right, my friends, we've come to the end of our time. Thank you very much for spending some time with us. And as always, we'd love to hear what you think about this or any suggestions that you got for webinars in the future. All right, take care, everyone.
Thank you.